28th, 2026. An aircraft touched down in Toulouse, France, having been in the air, without stopping, without refueling, without a single moment on the ground, for 24 hours and 24 minutes. It had taken off from Melbourne, Australia, crossed the Pacific Ocean, flown directly over the United States and Canada, crossed the Atlantic, and landed back where it started its journey, all in a single continuous flight. It was, by most measures, the longest flight ever completed by a commercial airliner. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to go back more than a century, to a time when simply staying in the air for a few minutes at a time was considered a miracle, and flying across an ocean without stopping was thought, by nearly everyone, to be physically impossible. This is the history of the non-stop flight. When the Wright brothers achieved the first powered, controlled flight in 1903, the entire accomplishment lasted 12 seconds and covered a distance shorter than the wingspan of a modern airliner. For years afterward, aviation's biggest achievements weren't measured in hours or even minutes, but in the simple, repeated act of staying airborne for slightly longer than the flight before it. Distance, in those earliest years, was almost beside the point. The real challenge was reliability. Getting an engine to run continuously without failing, keeping a wooden and fabric aircraft structurally intact under the strain of sustained flight, and simply proving that human beings could control a machine in the air for any meaningful length of time at all. Pilots in this era measured success in minutes airborne, not miles covered, and each small increase was treated as a genuine milestone worth celebrating. By the years following the First World War, aircraft technology had advanced enormously, driven largely by wartime demand for faster, more durable, more powerful aircraft, and ambitious aviators began setting their sights on something that had seemed unthinkable a decade earlier: crossing an entire ocean without landing. In 1919, British aviators John Alcock and Arthur Brown attempted exactly that, flying a modified bomber aircraft non-stop across the Atlantic, from Newfoundland to Ireland. The flight took just under 16 hours, through freezing temperatures, thick cloud, and icing conditions so severe that Brown reportedly had to climb out onto the wing repeatedly during the flight to physically chip ice off the engine instruments by hand. An almost unimaginable image today. A person clinging to the outside of an aircraft in flight, simply to keep it functioning. They landed, roughly, in an Irish bog, having successfully proven something the aviation world had genuinely doubted was possible. An aircraft could cross the Atlantic Ocean in a single continuous flight. The achievement was celebrated as one of the defining moments of early aviation, and it came with a substantial cash prize, offered years earlier by a British newspaper, specifically to whoever could accomplish a non-stop transatlantic crossing first, a reflection of just how far-fetched the achievement had seemed when the prize was originally announced. 8 years later, in 1927, Charles Lindbergh extended that achievement further, flying solo and non-stop from New York to Paris in a purpose-built aircraft, stripped of almost everything except fuel capacity. A flight lasting roughly 33.5 hours and covering over 3,000 miles. Lindbergh flew largely without the benefit of modern navigation tools, relying heavily on dead reckoning, basic compass headings, and careful time and speed calculations to stay roughly on course across an ocean with no landmarks whatsoever. Occasionally fighting exhaustion so severe that he later described briefly losing track of whether he was fully awake during parts of the flight. Lindbergh's flight captured global attention, not just because of the distance, but because of what it implied. If a single pilot in a small, specially built aircraft could cross an entire ocean alone, then regular, reliable long-distance air travel might genuinely be within reach, not just as a stunt, but eventually as routine transportation. For decades after Lindbergh's flight, long-distance aviation remained defined by extremes. Aircraft stripped down to bare essentials, pilots pushing physical endurance limits, and flights treated as record-setting spectacles rather than practical transportation. Commercial aviation, when it did cross oceans, typically required multiple fuel stops along established routes, breaking a long journey into several shorter, safer legs, rather than attempting anything close to a genuine non-stop crossing with paying passengers aboard. The arrival of the jet age in the 1950s and 1960s gradually changed this. Jet engines were more fuel efficient and more reliable than the piston engines that had powered earlier, long-range attempts. And aircraft designers began building larger, more capable long-range airliners, specifically intended to reduce the number of fuel stops on major international routes. Even so, for a long stretch of aviation history, twin-engine aircraft, the type eventually best suited to fuel-efficient long-range flying, were restricted by strict safety regulations from flying too far from the nearest available airport, out of caution around the reliability of a single remaining engine in the rare event that one failed mid-ocean. These regulations, known as ETOPS, extended twin-engine operations, gradually loosened over subsequent decades as engine reliability improved dramatically, opening up longer and longer non-stop routes that had previously been physically capable but not legally permitted. It was a rare case in aviation history where the technology to fly farther existed years before regulators were willing to allow it, precisely because trust in that technology had to be earned incrementally, flight by flight, over an extended track record. In 2005, a Boeing 777-200LR set what would become one of the most durable distance records in commercial aviation history, flying non-stop from Hong Kong to London the long way around, eastbound over the Pacific, across North America and the Atlantic, covering roughly the equivalent of nearly half the planet's circumference in a single flight, lasting almost 23 hours. That record stood, essentially unchallenged at a commercial level, for 2 decades. Part of the reason was economic rather than purely technical. Building an aircraft capable of flying that far requires trading passenger or cargo capacity for additional fuel capacity. And for most of the years since 2005, airlines simply didn't have enough demand for ultra-long-range routes to justify operating aircraft configured that specifically for maximum range over maximum payload. The technology to go slightly farther likely existed well before any airline had a compelling commercial reason to actually build and fly a plane that could do it. That calculation began to shift in the 2000s and 2000s as one airline in particular kept running into the same geographic problem no amount of scheduling cleverness could fully solve: Australia's extreme distance from almost everywhere else in the world. Qantas, Australia's national airline, had spent years exploring whether a genuinely non-stop route between its home country and destinations like London or New York was achievable, a project that eventually became known publicly as Project Sunrise, named for the way passengers on such a route might watch an entire sunrise cycle pass by during a single continuous flight. The core challenge remained consistent throughout. Existing aircraft could get close to the necessary range, but not quite far enough to make a genuinely non-stop, commercially viable service between Australia's East Coast and Europe, or the US East Coast. Airbus, working directly with Qantas's requirements, developed a specially modified version of its A350 O-1000 aircraft, the ULR, for ultra-long range, adding significant extra fuel capacity, reportedly holding tens of thousands of additional liters compared to the standard version, along with structural and systems adjustments needed to keep an aircraft, and everyone aboard it, functioning reliably for well over 20 consecutive hours in the air. The flight that broke the record didn't happen in a single afternoon. It was the return leg of a broader test campaign The same aircraft had already flown from France to Australia days earlier, a journey lasting around 19 hours, before turning around and attempting the return trip non-stop, deliberately choosing the longer eastbound routing out over the Pacific and across North America, specifically to push the aircraft's systems, fuel reserves, and crew endurance procedures to their absolute limits under realistic long-range conditions. The flight became something of a spontaneous public spectacle in its own right, tracked in real time by millions of people online. Watching a single aircraft icon crawl steadily across an enormous stretch of the planet on flight tracking websites over the better part of a full day. An oddly gripping way for the wider public to witness a genuine aviation milestone unfolding in close to real time, rather than reading about it only after the fact. 2 Qantas pilots joined the Airbus flight test crew for that return journey, gaining first-hand experience with exactly the kind of extreme duration operation the airline is preparing to run commercially, since Project Sunrise is intended to enter passenger service with non-stop flights between Australia and cities like London later in this decade. Achieving a flight this long isn't simply a matter of carrying more fuel, although that's certainly part of it. Every system on the aircraft and every person operating and riding in it has to be considered across a time frame several times longer than what a typical long-haul flight demands. Flight crews on ultra-long-range routes work under carefully designed rest and rotation schedules, since regulations limit how long any individual pilot can remain at the controls without a break, meaning flights of this length require multiple full flight crews, taking turns resting in dedicated crew rest compartments built into the aircraft specifically for this purpose, often tucked away above the main cabin or below the cockpit, out of sight of passengers entirely. Cabin air systems, engine performance, and fuel management all have to be validated, not just for a normal flight duration, but for genuinely extreme, continuous operation, essentially proving an aircraft can do reliably, for an entire day without pause, what most aircraft only ever need to sustain for a fraction of that time. There's a human factor buried in this as well, one airlines take seriously, precisely because Project Sunrise is ultimately meant to carry ordinary paying passengers, not just a handful of test engineers. Researchers have studied how extended time in a pressurized cabin, even a modern, well-designed one, affects circadian rhythm, hydration, and general well-being over a full 20-hour-plus stretch, informing decisions about cabin lighting schedules designed to mimic a natural day-night cycle, specific meal timing intended to help passengers adjust to their destination time zone before they even land, and cabin humidity levels kept higher than on a typical flight to reduce the discomfort that comes with spending the better part of a full day at altitude. Part of what made last month's flight feel different from earlier aviation milestones wasn't just the distance covered, but how the public experienced it happening. Alcock and Brown's Crossing in 1919 was known to the world only after the fact, reported in newspapers once the aircraft had already landed. Lindbergh's flight became a global sensation, but again, largely through after-the-fact reporting, and later, radio updates as they became available. The Airbus test flight, by contrast, was tracked continuously and publicly, in real time, by flight tracking websites and apps that anyone with an internet connection could open at any moment, watching a small aircraft icon inch steadily across an enormous stretch of ocean and continent over the better part of a full day. Reports suggest the flight became one of the most closely followed in the history of those tracking platforms, a strange modern kind of communal witnessing that simply didn't exist for any earlier record-setting flight in aviation history, turning a test flight conducted by a small crew of engineers and pilots into something millions of strangers experienced together, in slow motion from their phones. There's a strange symmetry worth sitting with between where this story started and where it stands now. In 1919, crossing the Atlantic non-stop required a co-pilot physically climbing out onto an open wing at altitude to chip ice off critical instruments by hand, simply to keep the aircraft flying long enough to reach land. A little over a century later, crossing not just an ocean but nearly the entire circumference of the planet non-stop has become a matter of climate-controlled crew rest compartments, redundant fuel systems, and pilots trading shifts in scheduled rotations, monitored the entire way by millions of strangers watching a small icon move slowly across a map on their phones. Neither achievement, separated by just over 100 years, would have been possible without the other. Every incremental step, Alcott and Brown's freezing crossing, Lindbergh's solo endurance flight, the arrival of reliable jet engines, the gradual loosening of twin-engine range restrictions, the 777's two-decade distance record, all of it had to happen, in roughly that order, before an aircraft could plausibly attempt what the A350-1000 ULR did over the Pacific last month. Somewhere out over the Pacific Ocean last month, an aircraft carrying a handful of test pilots and engineers quietly passed the 20-hour mark of a single continuous flight, still hours from home, tracked in real time by millions of people who had never met anyone on board. It is easy to see a record like that and think of it only as a number. 24 hours, 24 minutes, a statistic destined to be broken again eventually by some future aircraft not yet built. But it is worth remembering what that same 24 hours would have meant to two aviators freezing over the Atlantic in 1919, hand-chipping ice off a wing in the dark, uncertain whether their aircraft or they themselves would survive long enough to see land again. They would not have believed you if you told them that a century later, an aircraft would circle nearly the entire planet without ever touching the ground, and that people back home would watch it happen live, sipping coffee, glancing occasionally at their phones, treating the impossible as something closer to routine.